Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In today's video, we're heading back to one of the most stunning and straight-up scary places in the US, the Appalachian Mountains. I've been loving making these videos and reading all the wild stories you've sent in about this region. In one of today's stories, we'll follow a group of friends who took a trip out to the Smokies and ran into something downright bizarre. And in another, we'll hear from a park ranger who opened up about one of the strangest things he's ever experienced on the job. Thanks for hanging out with me. And as always, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're feeling extra generous, go ahead and share this with your friends. It really helps the channel a ton. All right, let's get into it. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. All right, guys, so buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound absolutely insane, and if I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd probably think it was some campfire creepypasta too. But it's real. Or at least it felt damn real. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but I need to get this story off my chest before it eats me alive. Maybe someone out there's heard something similar. Maybe you've been in the Smokies and seen things you couldn't explain. I've replayed this story in my head 1,000 times. So this all happened at the tail end of April 2024. But to really understand why it shook me so bad, you need the backstory, which starts about 6 years earlier. Back in 2017, I joined this kinda scrappy Facebook group for amateur hikers. It was nothing fancy. Just a loose collection of dudes across the southeast who wanted to hike more but didn't have buddies into it. You'd post a trail, see who wanted in, meet up, and hit the woods. That's how I met Jared, Mark, Spencer, and John. Over time, the 5 of us formed a solid crew. We'd plan 2- and 3-day hikes across Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, anywhere with trees and some elevation. We got close, not just in a we camp together way, but in a share your weird dreams and fight over the last can of chili kind of way. You don't get that often past your 20s. For years, we kept talking about hitting the Great Smoky Mountains. It's like the crown jewel around here, but somehow it just kept slipping through the cracks. Either bad timing, weather, permits. We had all the excuses. But last April, we finally made it happen. We planned a 5-day trek through one of the less traveled sections, the kind of path you don't find on Pinterest lists or beginner blogs. This stretch was remote as hell. Primitive shelters spaced far apart, steep inclines, dense forest. The good stuff. We all met up at the trailhead on a crisp Wednesday morning. There was frost on the grass and our breath fogged up when we talked. Not the typical weather for this time of year. But at higher elevations in the Smokies, you can still get some cold snaps in spring. We parked our cars on this sketchy little gravel road that might as well have been a logging path and started hiking. The first day was stunning. Clear skies, spring buds starting to pop, fresh leaves underfoot. That kind of quiet you only get when you're miles away from anything resembling a town. We reached the first shelter around 6 p.m. just as the sun started bleeding orange across the sky. It was one of those classic 3-wall wooden shelters, a little rickety, but it held up. When we rolled in, there was already someone there, which was unexpected, but not totally unusual. He looked maybe mid-40s, rough around the edges type with this weather-beaten tan coat, a bushy gray beard, and a backpack that had clearly seen better decades. He said his name was Ray, claimed he was a hunter. When we asked what he was hunting, he kind of smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes and said, "Not sure you'd believe me." We laughed it off, figured he was just one of those dudes who liked the sound of his own mystery. None of the 5 of us really cared about hunting or hearing hunting stories. so we didn't ask. If he wanted to play mysterious, we let him. We cooked our dried dinners, told some old stories, and turned in as the rain started tapping on the roof. Nothing too serious, it was just a light drizzle. Pretty common in that area, and something we were already expecting. I remember that morning clearly, mostly because I'd slept unusually well, all things considered. I wasn't in a bed. I was zipped inside a sleeping bag, half exposed to the woods, sharing a shelter with 5 other guys. Still, I felt rested. That was my first thought when I opened my eyes. But almost immediately I realized someone was already up. Jared wasn't in his bag. I sat up and spotted him outside the shelter, standing completely still, staring at the ground like he was trying to figure something out. He must have felt me watching, because he glanced over his shoulder and gave me a subtle wave, like, "Come look at this." Something in his face told me it wasn't nothing. When I stepped outside and reached the edge of the shelter, I saw it. The ground was a mess of footprints, dozens of them, all barefoot. They were small, maybe a woman's size or a teenager's, but something wasn't right. The shape was strange. The toes were too long, almost like fingers. There was no sign of a struggle, no skid marks or drag lines. Just those weird, clean prints stamped deep into the wet earth, circling our shelter. We ended up waking the others, hoping maybe one of them had sleepwalked or something. As unlikely as it was, part of me still wanted it to be one of us. Anything to make sense of those prints. But no. Everyone still had their socks on, clean and dry. Their boots were soaked, still caked with mud from the day before, except for Ray's. His boots were bone dry. That alone would have been strange enough, but the way he acted made it worse. While the rest of us stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Ray barely reacted. It was like he'd expected it. He looked down at the prints for a moment, then calmly started packing his gear. He told us he'd be continuing the trail on his own. We asked if he knew what had made those tracks, and by the way he answered, it was obvious he did. Said that was the reason he'd come out there in the first place. Someone asked if it was some kind of animal, and he just shrugged it off. Then he mentioned something about those mountains being older than we realized. Then, he slung his pack over his shoulder and walked off in the direction of the prints. The rest of us just stood there, staring at each other, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. We figured it was best to keep moving too, but in the opposite direction of the footprints, and of Ray. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same. We spent most of the day tossing around theories, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some weird locals messing around. And yeah, we even brought up the old legends, stories we'd heard growing up about strange things living out in these mountains. By the time the sun started going down, we were exhausted, mentally and physically. We just wanted to forget the whole thing. We told ourselves we were far enough away now, that whatever it was, it wouldn't happen again. And even though some of us talked about heading back early, we convinced ourselves it was probably a prank and decided to stick to the plan, at least for one more night. But obviously, we were wrong and the story didn't end there. New shelter, same freaking thing. It had rained lightly, and in the morning, there they were. More of those bizarre barefoot prints. This time, there were more. A lot more. We counted nearly 11 distinct prints. Maybe more. Like whoever, or whatever, was out there had been pacing around us all night long. That was the moment it really sank in for all of us. Something wasn't right out there, and whatever it was, it had been close. Too close. I've always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of guy who could sleep through a storm. But Mark wakes up if a branch shifts in the wind. He kept going on about how there was no way something, or someone, could have been circling us without making a sound. Not a single snap, not a crunch. Even on soft ground, you'd expect a noise. But it was like they floated. 5 grown men, dead asleep, while those prints were being laid down just feet from where we slept. It didn't add up. None of it did. By the 4th night, nerves were frayed. We were physically exhausted, emotionally wrecked, and the weather turned nasty. Cold, relentless rain hammered the forest, soaking everything. The final shelter was more rundown than the rest, like no one had used it in years. We huddled inside, barely talking. Something had changed. The woods felt aware. That's the only word I've got for it. That night, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. So even though we were sleeping in a shelter, we rigged up a tarp over the entrance to block the wind and rain. We also agreed not to all sleep at once, just in case. We took shifts. I was on watch around 4:30 a.m., sitting there in the dark, gun in hand, mostly just listening to the storm batter the trees. And then I saw movement. I was looking through a small gap we'd left near the tarp, barely wide enough to notice unless you knew it was there. And through that sliver, I saw them. They stepped out from the tree line like a hallucination. 7 figures. Human-like, but wrong. Too small. Not like little people, but like adults who never fully developed. Every part of them seemed off, frail, undergrown, almost fragile. They were completely naked and somehow unfazed by the cold. Just walking slowly, silently, circling the shelter like they were studying it. I was frozen, gun in hand, but completely locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was clearly terrified, but weirdly fascinated too. What the hell was I looking at? I reached over and tapped Mark's leg. He woke up like he'd been trained for it. I motioned for silence and shifted so he could take my spot and see for himself. But as he moved, the plastic on his sleeping bag made the tiniest noise. And that was enough. The figures bolted, darted back into the forest like animals. By the time he got a clear look, all he caught was their backs disappearing into the dark. They moved impossibly fast and quiet, like the forest swallowed them whole. We sat there in silence, the kind that feels thick and full of questions. I could feel his body tense next to mine, like the fear had seeped into his muscles. When he finally whispered, he just asked what the hell that was. I didn't have an answer. I was just relieved he saw them too, because if he hadn't, I would have spent the rest of my life trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. They were moving in these smooth, floating circles. Not like they were sneaking, but like they had all the time in the world. Their limbs were too long, knees bending a little wrong, and they made no sound. The ground was soggy mud, and they were barefoot, but not a single squish or squelch. It was like they were weightless. Eventually, we woke the others to tell them what had just happened. Honestly, both of us felt ridiculous saying it out loud, but no one questioned it. No one laughed or pushed back. I think deep down, they all already knew something was out there, and now, 2 of us had seen it with our own eyes. At least now we could put a shape to those footprints. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Even though they didn't seem dangerous and hadn't done anything to us. In fact, they'd run the moment they heard a noise. We still decided it was time to get out of those mountains. We couldn't make sense of what we'd seen. Truth is, none of us had ever heard stories about feral people in the Smokies. Sure, we'd heard rumors from other parts of the Appalachian Trail, but never in this area. In fact, we didn't even know if they were people. Yeah, they looked more like people than any other animal. But at the same time, their bodies were just bizarre. We filed a report with the rangers when we got back, told them everything. One of them took notes, nodded slowly, and when we pushed him for answers, he just smiled and said, "Lot of stories up in those woods. Most of them don't lead anywhere." But it wasn't the kind of smile that says he doesn't believe you. It was the kind that says he's heard this before, maybe too many times. And now, I can't stop wondering about Ray. That dude knew. I'm convinced of it. He came out there to hunt, but didn't say what. I don't think he was out there for deer or bear. I think he was after those things. And the truth is, that thought really saddens me. Despite everything, those things weren't dangerous. They didn't try to interact with us. They didn't try to hurt us. What scares me is how people can't seem to handle the unknown without feeling the need to destroy it. My name is Liam, and 5 years ago I retired. I was a park ranger my entire life, and, as you can imagine, I have enough material to write several books about everything I've seen and experienced in our national parks. As you might expect, there's a lot I'm not at liberty to say openly, but over the years I've shared a few stories, some quirky with happy endings, others deeply disturbing with the worst outcomes imaginable. And then there are the ones I consider the worst of all, the ones that remain unexplained, the ones that leave us with only one certainty, that something truly terrible happened, even if we don't know exactly what. Those are, in fact, the hardest to bear, because they're the ones that haunt us, that stay with us over the years, and keep us up at night. This particular story I'm about to tell you is one that's been keeping me up for years. And what eats away at me the most isn't even the violence of what I witnessed, but the lack of answers, the absolute silence from the proper authorities. What upsets me the most is feeling like maybe I never got any explanation, not because there wasn't one, but because they simply didn't want to give it to me. Because, and I am sure of this, something confidential is going on in those mountains. Like I said, this all happened quite a few years ago, and at the time, the search and rescue tools and protocols were very different from what we have now. Far less developed, and a lot more limited. Starting from the beginning. That night I was on patrol in a section of the Appalachian Trail. Forgive me for not being more specific, but I've gotten into trouble before for trying to bring this story to light, so this time I'm playing it safe. What I can tell you is that it happened in an area long considered problematic, where disappearances occur way more often than in other forests, and where crimes, when they do happen, tend to be especially brutal and violent. Working that area always had a strange duality to it. On one hand, it's breathtakingly beautiful, but on the other, it forces you to stay constantly alert, 200% focused, always paying attention to your surroundings, because at any given moment, some unhinged person could show up ready to cause trouble. Night had just fallen when I got an order to investigate a campsite that, according to reports, had been abandoned. The family of a couple had raised the alarm after losing contact with them, and the woman was found in a chaotic state. Up to that point, only the woman had been found, wandering alone down a road, in a state of deep shock, with her clothes torn and unable to form coherent sentences. She'd been taken to the hospital the day before, but the truth was, very little was known. My mission was to locate where they had camped and, if I could confirm the spot, call for backup. The man, as of then, was still missing. No one knew where he was. And according to the woman herself, she didn't even seem to remember having a husband. That's how confused and mentally scattered she was. Finding the campsite wasn't hard, since the family had a pretty good idea of where they wanted to camp and even had some rough coordinates. The hardest part was actually dealing with what I found there and trying to make any logical sense of what might have happened. I'd been hiking for around 45 minutes when I started hearing sounds in the distance. At first, I assumed it was an animal, something totally normal and, honestly, not something that worried me in the slightest. But as I got closer, I started to realize there was something oddly human about those sounds. When I finally reached the clearing, I was met with a scene of total destruction. The campsite was completely trashed, and in the middle of the chaos was a man in rags digging a massive hole with his bare hands. He was doing it compulsively, frenetically, almost like an animal, with his fingertips bloody and caked with dirt. In such a disturbing state that I froze for a few seconds. I should have called for backup immediately, but the truth is, I was so shocked by the image in front of me that I chose instead to approach slowly, trying to understand what was going on. Not for a second did I think he could be dangerous, until he punched me square in the face, knocking me backward, my head hitting a rock, and I blacked out instantly. When I woke up, it was pitch dark. The pain at the back of my head was unbearable, and there was no sign of the man anywhere. My radio was still on, and luckily, when they lost my signal, they sent in an emergency team. I got up with difficulty, still staggering, and tried to figure out what was going on around me. Even though the campsite looked like it had been attacked by wild animals, everything turned upside down, food scattered, tent half collapsed. What really unsettled me was the complete silence. Not a sound. Just total, silent chaos. I searched the tent, which was empty, and started walking around. There were signs of rotting food, dirty clothes, several barefoot footprints that seemed to belong to different people. And that's when I heard something. Faint breathing. Almost imperceptible. That made me realize I wasn't alone. I looked around instinctively, but saw no one. My eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing, the dense dark trees, and that's when I remembered the hole the man had been digging. I headed over, and when I peeked inside, I felt a deep chill. The man was lying at the bottom of the hole, motionless, curled up almost in a fetal position, like he was either dead or asleep. Despite the scare, I could see his chest rising and falling. That's when I realized just how huge that hole was. It was big enough to fit a full-grown adult without having to crouch. The ground was tough, full of thick roots and tall grass. How long had it taken him to dig that with nothing but his hands? I took cover in the woods, hiding, and called for backup. I didn't want to wake the man and risk any kind of confrontation, so I stayed hidden until help arrived. It was a relief to know they were already on their way and would be there soon. When the team finally got there, getting the man out of the hole was anything but easy. He was in full survival mode, aggressive and disoriented, like a trapped animal. That was the moment it became crystal clear to me that something truly traumatic had happened to them. The family hadn't heard from them in over 2 weeks, and until the woman was found, they thought everything was fine. But their behavior, especially the look in that man's eyes, wasn't just fear. It was the look of someone permanently scarred by something that can't be explained. Both were taken to the hospital, and an investigation was launched. But I never got any answers. Every time I tried to learn more from my superiors, they just told me my job was done and there was nothing to report. Among the other rangers, theories started circulating. Some said they were on drugs, that they'd eaten some toxic plant, or that they were hallucinating from hunger. But none of us had the faintest idea what really happened. I later found out that the woman, despite her fragmented speech, kept insisting they were attacked by people from the forest. And that's when I remembered something I'd brushed off before. Maybe because of the blow to my head. The campsite was full of barefoot footprints. The man was wearing shoes when we found him. Same with the woman. Sure, they could have walked around barefoot at some point, but there were too many footprints, and they looked like they belonged to different people. Why wasn't any of this mentioned in the official reports? I don't have proof of what I'm telling you. All I have is my gut, telling me something more happened in that forest, and no one wants to talk about it. One detail I've never been able to forget is that both of them had deep wounds on their bodies. Wounds that couldn't have been self-inflicted. Either they attacked each other, which seems unlikely, or they were attacked by someone else. But by who? And why? Months later, I tried to contact them or their families, but was told they didn't want to talk about it anymore. I tried to move on, I swear I did. But 2 years later, in that exact same spot, 3 friends emerged from the woods in a state of absolute panic, claiming they'd been chased by a group of people. The investigation was shallow, almost symbolic, and it was said that the whole thing was just something the kids made up for attention. But I saw one of them, I saw his face. And I know that no one fakes that kind of fear. No one acts out pure panic that well, especially not to get on the news. And this case, once again, didn't even make it to the news. The truth is, I don't have answers, only questions. And something tells me I'll die, never knowing what really goes on in that forgotten part of the Appalachian Mountains.